I want to touch on the idea of second-class citizens. We also provided a model for that as well.
You bet. So there were a couple of varieties of second-class citizenship law in the U.S. First, of course, there was de facto second-class citizenship for African Americans. In practice, achieved in particular through restrictions on voting rights and things like that, which we're seeing again now in the U.S. That de facto form of second-class citizenship really couldn't have been a model for the Nazis. It was impossible to declare American blacks not to be citizens because the 14th Amendment guaranteed their citizenship. So American law had to use all kinds of subterfuges and workarounds and tricks in order to deprive blacks of meaningful citizenship. The Nazis were never going to do that kind of thing. They were just going to be completely open about their creation of the form of second-class citizenship. There was, however, another variety of second-class citizenship law in the U.S. In particular, Filipinos and Native Americans were classified as non-citizen nationals. Native Americans until 1924. There were also questions about what to do with Puerto Ricans and Hawaiians. The question of the Filipinos was the most important, though. That arose after American victory in the Spanish-American War, which made the U.S. a colonial power for the first time. And American lawyers, the Supreme Court in particular, created a special category called non-citizen national to deal with Filipinos. That, strikingly, is the same category that showed up for Jews in the Nuremberg laws. Now, I don't want to claim, I can't show you that that was a direct borrowing from the U.S., and I wouldn't want to push it that hard. But they certainly talked about American second-class citizenship law a lot, and regardless of whether there was a direct borrowing, there clearly was a sense of inspiration or readiness to welcome the existence of another parallel regime.
And so just to be clear, for folks who aren't clear with the terminology, de facto is that it's not explicit. It is sort of like you say, backdoor policies that sort of skirt around the law. De jure would be specific laws that are very explicit and do it. And so when they look at the creation of second-class citizens de jure, from a de jure standpoint, are there sort of intermediary steps that must be taken? In other words, we have certain qualifications, certain criteria that we set up that are philosophically grounded in this. These people came to this country, and we have an association with them, but they haven't been citizens in the past. I mean, I know that in Germany, there were emancipatory laws in the 1880s that allowed essentially Jews to assimilate into society. What did these Nazi lawyers sort of go back and say the methodology in which they came into society is similar to the way that Filipinos were welcomed to the United States mainland, not as citizens? I mean, what is the sort of intermediary steps between this is the situation we have as the status quo now, this is where we want to get to, what do we have to legally find about the Jews or the Gypsies or whomever it is that we want to make second-class citizens? Are there intermediary steps that must be taken to get to that classification?
Sure, although that's a great question, if I may say so. You're right, the same problem does present itself with the Filipinos, who were a conquered people who had not previously been integrated into the population. The answer to your question is that, yes, you have to have some means of stripping people of citizenship. The Nazis didn't make a whole lot of heavy weather about that. They just did it. What is true more broadly in immigration law in this period, really throughout the Atlantic world, is that there was a lot of citizenship stripping going on. So in the U.S., communists would be stripped of their citizenship. As a matter of for example, not all, obviously, by any means, but some. But you're absolutely right that something of that kind had to be done. As a matter of the politics in Germany, the first targets for the Nazis were Jews who had arrived in Germany essentially around the time of the First World War. They were the first to be stripped of citizenship, but of course it was easy to identify them as newcomers. It's only in 1935 that the indigenous German Jewish population got targeted the way it was legally. Obviously, lots have been going on, right. But in this respect, in 1935 in the Nuremberg laws.
I mean,
so yeah, they did face this problem and found it much easier to deal with the Eastern European Jews who had showed up relatively recently.
Yeah, I mean, and I ask because I mean, I think it's really important that people understand that dynamic. That you know, we like to think like, oh, they're Nazis. Why wouldn't they just? They could just say like they're all illegal. But in fact, even they, within the context of sort of the politics, and to maintain some fealty to the, I guess, you know, the integrity of a legal mechanism. They've got to take this step-by-step process. Just for a moment, tell us a little bit about the clash between the juristic, I guess, moderates and the Nazi radicals.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that emerges very strikingly, in particular, from the transcript of the June 1934 meeting that we mentioned before. There was a real clash there between Nazi radicals who wanted two things. They, first of all, of course, wanted a full-scale realization of the Nazi program, but they also didn't want to have to worry too much about the legal niceties on the one hand. And on the other hand, people who, strange as the phrase may sound, have to be called moderate Nazis. I mean, these were all nasty people. I say that not to defend them. They were moderates only in the sense that they really wanted to stick to inherited norms of the rule of law, didn't think you really could or should go as far as the radicals wanted to do. One of the striking things about that particular meeting, let me say one more thing about it, the moderates in particular had a sort of a quasi-official status at that stage in the German state. Hitler had come to power with the support of what we usually call nationalist conservatives, and there were plenty of them there. In the bureaucracy, in the justice ministry, these were not Nazis, although they were certainly right-wingers of a very objectionable kind, and it was those people in particular, they included the Minister of Justice himself, who were insisting on norms of the rule of law, and in fact, in early June of 1934 at that meeting, they won the day. Only later in that month, after an event called the Night of the Long Knives, a couple of nights of mass murder, did it become clear that there was really not much hope for anything like a moderate program. Sorry, go ahead.
And well, and the moderates would argue too that the moderation is not they're not looking for moderation on any type of like moral grounds, but more on durability of a regime, right? I mean that you need to have it grounded in societal laws.
Absolutely. There also was a sense among them that, for example, something like criminalizing interracial marriage was just outside the norms of civilization. You couldn't do something like that.
Even though that's happening in 30 states in the United States.
Even though it's happening in 30 states in the U.S. Although it's very interesting when the Justice Minister presented that fact about American law, he added, but we don't know if they really do it. We can't believe they actually do this in practice, he said. I mean, he was wrong.
Right. And in fact, in 1935, there was a study tour by German lawyers to look at this sort of dynamic up close, but there's not a lot of documentation of that tour.
Yeah, sadly. There was a group of 45 Nazi lawyers who came to study the United States. But I haven't been able to dig up much about what happened when they got here, although there are some stories to tell about their trip.
I feel like I heard once that they based their uniforms off of Massachusetts State troopers. I don't know if
Did
it
they
came.
Really?
I heard something to that it was that you know, I don't know if that was just apocryphal as I was growing up in Massachusetts, but maybe that was just something that high schoolers told each other when they were getting stopped for liquor. But I've heard that.
One does have to worry about the source if it's high schoolers.
Yes,
for sure.
yes. I just wanted to make that clear. All right. Well, lastly, I want to just talk about the sort of the ethos, the egalitarian quality that was sort of similar in Nazi and American law, egalitarian, but also limited in terms of where that concept applies to.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So here I'd like to emphasize something that's not obvious to most modern Americans. Egalitarianism is a tough sell politically. It's hard to get people to believe that everybody is equal and there aren't some superiors and some inferiors. And one of the things we see in both Nazi Germany and in the U.S., and by the way, also in other British dominions and other parts of the British Empire, is the tendency for egalitarianism to show up first as egalitarianism only for white people. and at the expense of others who are going to be excluded. And in that sense, historically, egalitarianism and racism really seem to have gone hand in hand. There's a memorable moment in the memoirs of John Quincy Adams when he's talking to John C. Calhoun, and Calhoun says, we have to have race slavery because it's the only thing that makes all the white people feel equal to each other. The Nazis took much the same view of things. Their claim was really a strongly egalitarian one, that all Germans, even poor ones, even ones of historically low social status, were all equally members of the master race. And that was a big part of how Hitler sold the program. But of course, you can only sell that program if the equal status of the superior race came at the expense of others. And that was the pattern you saw in the U.S. for a very long time. And, hard as it may seem to swallow, it's the same pattern you see in Nazi politics in the 1930s.
Yeah, and what's also fascinating, and just as a programming note, next week we're going to play an interview with Richard Rothstein, who wrote about de jure discrimination against particularly African Americans in housing policy coming out during this era, really, of the New Deal. And his argument is that it was unconstitutional, but this was not an anomaly, let's put it that way, I guess, that the Nazis were able to find these laws to base their laws on, because to a large extent, this was U.S. society. In some respects, it was almost as if they were headed in different tracks to a certain extent, yes?
Yeah. Well, you may know Ira Katz-Nelson in particular wrote a book about exactly the phenomena you're describing called When Affirmative Action Was White, about this period. In the background, there's a background fact that has to be emphasized. It makes us a little bit uncomfortable, but the Democratic Party, especially in the early 1930s, was heavily dependent on the support of the segregationist South. For that reason, the New Deal programs are often New Deal programs that make us pretty uncomfortable now for exactly the reasons that you've mentioned. This was a time of real uncertainty in American politics, and real uncertainty, particularly in the early 30s, about what form the New Deal was going to take.
Hi, folks. Sam Seder here. We still need your help on our Patreon page. YouTube ads have come back, but not nearly as much as we had before. So if you can help us out, any little bit helps. Head over to our Patreon page right at this URL, and you'll help us keep helping you by making videos